Hello, my name is Corey Howard. I will be speaking on the book of Isaiah today, with particularly in reference to 3rd Isaiah. Now, as we know, Isaiah is a little bit different from some of the other prophets in the book of the Bible because it encompasses three prophets by the name of Isaiah, which are three different time frames. Where 1st Isaiah, which we'll also call Proto Isaiah, are books 1 through 39. He was in the 8th century. Second Isaiah, which is known as Deutero Isaiah, were books 40 through 55, and third Isaiah, who is Trito Isaiah, which are books 56 through 66. And second and third Isaiah were both in the 6th century. So there's about a 200-year gap in between all three prophets in this particular instance. But when it comes to third Isaiah, we're going to focus on him, which of course you'll hear me also call him Trito down the line here. But the thing about third Isaiah is while the Israelites were in exiles, they're going to be the focus of third Isaiah. That is very important. But what we're going to do here is we're going to focus on third Isaiah. Now, one thing about third Isaiah, which is the landscape of the time when third Isaiah was um, said to prophesy to the people of Israel. Now, you got to look at the situation where the Persian Empire, or the newly formed Persian Empire, which was led under Cyrus the Great, they just captured or taken over Babylon, and in doing so, they exiled all of the captives or inhabitants that were in Babylon at that time, including slaves. In that instance, the Israelites that were there at the time, and anyone else from other foreign lands, they had nowhere to go. What makes that very interesting within this story is as they're exiled and leaving Babylon, the Israelites are heading back to Jerusalem. But the thing is, they're not heading back by themselves. The foreigners from these other lands, the slaves, anyone else, they're basically traveling with them because they have nowhere else to go. And this is going to be a constant story within what happens in third Isaiah, because third Isaiah is one of the first prophets who actually is not just focusing on the people of Israel. He actually prophesies to foreigners as well, and giving them the word from the Lord that would pertain to them as well. So it's going to have a key significance later on within this story. Now, what builds up to this story is that these people were slaves. Some of them were slaves. They are very poor. So everyone traveling back to Jerusalem, they are very defeated. And what makes it even worse is that when they get to Jerusalem, they find that their homeland is utterly in shambles, completely destroyed. The temple is destroyed. The city is in ruins. So they come back to absolutely nothing after being exiled and traveling back. And the last thing you want to get to is to have absolutely nothing in that instance. So this is what made it important because at the time there were more than one prophet around. Haggai and Zechariah, they were also around with third Isaiah at the same time frame, and they were prophesying also to the Israelites in that particular instance and in this situation. Now, one thing that makes third Isaiah or Trito Isaiah important is not the fact that he prophesied to the people of Israel. The Lord called him so that he would actually prophesy to all people. So that is one of the interesting things about him in this particular instance. Now, there's not much known about Isaiah, and other than the fact that the Lord called him, and in Isaiah 61 verse 1, he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed." So in that instance, Isaiah comes around into the picture while in exile. The year is about 520, between 520 to 515. And his whole story, the whole thing about Isaiah being there is to enlighten these people and to enlighten everybody and let them know that the Lord is there for them and basically what the Lord has planned for them and what he wants them to do. Not just the Israelites, because of course the Israelites are going to come back, rebuild their city, rebuild their temple. But one thing about that, and of course eventually rebuild their government. But one thing that makes this story actually very interesting is that the Lord prophesied also to the foreigners so that they would also be included in this rebuilding process so that this rebuilding process was not just going to be done by the Israelites. And he actually go further within the prophecy here. So that what makes this interesting. Now, when it comes to Isaiah and the book of Isaiah itself, it was one of the scrolls found. I believe it was not complete when it was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But one thing about Isaiah is that when reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it did say that Isaiah was not a complete scroll and it may have been in parts. So I'm not sure if when they found that, if third Isaiah was considered a secondary or third scroll that they found and attached it to Isaiah. That's just something I have not found clarity on, but it was found at the same time with the Dead Sea. Now, one thing that is key when it comes to third Isaiah is the fact that he is not prophesying to kings in this particular instance. He's not prophesying to spiritual leaders or priests and or to soldiers in that instance. He is prophesying directly to the people of Israel and to these foreigners. So that's a little bit different from the other prophets who had different posts other than just prophesying. They were linked under a king, and that's who they were prophesying to, or the priests in the temples in this instance. The temple did not exist. And the thing that Isaiah was doing was he was giving this message from the Lord that they're going to go forth and fulfill the promise of the Lord, rebuild the city, and that they're going to rebuild the temple in this instance and eventually rebuild their government. And that's one of the things that was important about Isaiah. But in doing so, he also did have a message for those who were going to forsake the Lord, who did not want to worship the Lord or make sacrifices to the Lord. And he wanted to let them know that there were consequences for doing so as well. So Isaiah did have a job to do in that instance of not just prophesying to those who were willing to follow the Lord, but also to those who were not, and basically establish another type of covenant with the people of that time. Now, some of the important verses that follow Isaiah in this instance are first starting right at the beginning of Isaiah 56, where Trito Isaiah first starts here. And the first thing that says is that Isaiah he invites all to worship the Lord, Israelites and foreigners. Basically, he wants them to maintain justice and keep Yahweh's Sabbath. And that was for Israelites and foreigners. He also instructed them that they could come and make sacrifices. They can also um, work with the Israelites and foreigners as one and to go forth and rebuild his temple, rebuild the ruins of his city, and basically rebuild a foundation for the future generations in that area. Now, in doing so, there's also some things that displease Yahweh, and he wanted to let them know that in Isaiah 59, verses 16 through 21, where he says, "The Lord was displeased with the injustices of their adversaries and will repay, so that they fear the Lord and for his people create a covenant." So in that instance, he was also saying the ones that have done wrong by the Israelites, he was going to make them pay for everything in that particular instance as well as a new covenant to them. But that is pretty much the basis that you follow throughout third Isaiah in this particular instance. Now, later on, he also says in Isaiah 60:10 that foreigners shall build up your walls, and their kings shall minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you down, but in my favor I have had mercy on you. So basically letting them know that in that instance that if they're doing what he is asking them to do, if they're following Yahweh, then they will have mercy and be in his favor in that particular instance. But if they are not doing what he is instructing them to do, then they will be struck down. Now, one other verse that I feel and there's a few other verses which are, of course, are important, but something that stands out is the verse of Isaiah 66:22 and 23. Now, what is interesting about these two verses, and as I read through and going through some of the research in this, is that some of the scholars feel that this is the first prophecies that go towards Revelations, which actually say, "For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says the Lord, your descendants and your name remain, for new moon to new moon, and from new Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, say the Lord." And what they're saying in that instance is it's a revelation of a new earth being reborn in that instance. So that is one of those things that is very important that stands out in the verses. Now, in this particular Now, some of the things that stand out here in the time and place of when this happened, based on some of the scholarly research that I was doing, um, from things that different scholars have said in their writings, um, that a few things stand out. One is that Mount Zion is where Third Isaiah did majority of his speaking in this instance, and Mount Zion holds an important place that some scholars have compared it to Mount Sinai in this instance of being like a holy mountain. In that instance, that is where the Israelites and the foreigners in this particular instance made sacrifices to Yahweh. They actually had their offerings there. And basically, that was where this started of when third Isaiah is speaking to the people and delivering his message. But they feel that being the highest point there in Jerusalem, that it holds a sense of importance, not as important as Mount Sinai, but almost identical to it. So it does have a sense of relevance in that instance that it is Mount Sinai and it is a holy place in that instance. Now, the other thing that stands out that some scholars have mentioned is that by having foreigners coming into the mix here and actually making sacrifices and worshiping Yahweh and being accepted to worship Yahweh, that this is the birth of the Gentiles and it's basically the beginning of Christianity. In this instance, some would say, or just in as Gentiles in the Bible, or the mention of Gentiles in the Bible in this instance. So that is another key point that is very significant as well because it gives us a course of where Christianity is important to all believers other than just the Jews. So it now gives more relevance of the Christian faith or the beginning of what could possibly be considered the Christian faith. And lastly, one thing that I misquoted was the verse when I mentioned the revelations when it comes to chapter 66. And one of the verses that needed to be in there as well is 66:15, by the way. So that is, "For the Lord will come in fire in his chariot like the whirlwind and pay back his anger and fury and his rebuke in flames of fire. For by fire will the Lord execute judgment, and by his sword on all flesh, and those slain by the Lord shall be many." So, in that instance, that's where I was talking about the verses that could be revelation. And the verse after that actually says, "Those who sanctify and purify themselves to go into the garden, following the one sinner, eating flesh of pig, vermin, rodents, shall come to an end together, say the Lord." So that is where the revelationary text comes from within third Isaiah. So third Isaiah actually plays a important role in, I feel, with Israel and for foreigners, the beginning of Christianity, and then even prophesizing what could possibly be verses to go towards revelations as well, with regards to that. So that will conclude my presentation on third Isaiah, also known as Trito Isaiah, which is Isaiah verses 56, chapters 56 through 66. Thank you very much.